Hello learners, today we are going to discuss on landscape ecology. In this session, we are going to touch upon landscape ecology, its concept, factors affecting changes in landscape diversity, landscape ecology and natural resource management, and future of landscape ecology. When you talk about the basic of landscape ecology, we will touch upon its principal methods of landscape ecology, then concept of scale, and its evolution and theory of landscape ecology. The term landscape ecology was first introduced by the German biogeographer Karl Troll in 1939, incorporating the regional geography and vegetation science, and particularly inspired by the distinct perspective offered by aerial photography. Landscape ecology essentially combined the spatial approach of the geographer with the functional approach of the ecologist. It emphasized the interaction between the spatial pattern and ecological process, that is, the causes and consequence of spatial heterogeneity across a range of scales. We will see different landscape here across India. As you know from these few slides, we will see a landscape is a heterogeneous land area that is often hierarchically structured, and it's an open system with matter, energy, resources, organisms flows across landscape boundaries and in interaction with other landscape, as we know, known as landscape function or its processes. For example, we will see the nutrients and pollutants that following hydrological flows that finally reach aquatic system from upland, thus flowing across landscape boundaries. Both landscape structure and landscape functions change over time and across space due to the natural as well as anthropogenic disturbances. These changes may be in a variety of ways, and the rates of change may vary across a landscape. For instance, a contiguous large landscape may be fragmented into smaller pieces, or some landscape elements may be lost. Sometimes it happens in forest ecosystem. So depending on intensity and frequency of disturbances, some change takes place instantly while other changes take place in a gradual manner. So what are the principles of landscape ecology? In 1995, landscape ecologists Khuman listed 12 principles of landscape ecology. The 12 principles can be organized into 4 categories. They are landscape and regions as first category, patches and corridors, mosaics, and application. When we look into the category of landscape and regions, we'll see under 2 subcategories, landscape and region. Under this, the principle states that a mix of local ecosystem or land use type is repeated over the land forming a landscape, which is the basic element in a region at broader scale and composed of a non-repetitive, high-contrast, coarse-grained pattern of landscapes. And patch corridor matrix principle states that the arrangement or structural pattern of patches, corridors, and a matrix that constitute a landscape is a major determinant of functional flows and movements through the landscape, and of changes in its patterns and process over time. For example, any mosaics including forested, dry, cultivated, and suburban area. Under the category of patches and corridor, the basic principles: large natural vegetation patches, then page safe, interaction among ecosystems, metapopulation dynamics. Large natural vegetation patches, it states that these are the structure in a landscape that protect aquifers and interconnected stream networks, sustain viable population of most species, provide core habitat, and escape over most large home range vertebrates, and tolerate near natural disturbance regimes. The page safe principle states that an ecologically optimum page safe to accomplish several key functions as well as a large core with some curvilinear boundaries and narrow lobes. The page safe depends on orientation angle related to the hydrologic flows. The principle of interaction among ecosystems, it states that all ecosystems in a landscape are interrelated with movement or flow rate of materials dropping sharply with distance but more gradually for species interactions between ecosystems of the same type, while metapopulation dynamics principle states that for subpopulation on separate patches, the local extinction rate decreases with greater habitat quality or patch size, and the recolonization increases with corridors, stepping stones, a suitable matrix habitat, or short interpass distance. Under the category of mosaics, you will see four important principles. The landscape resistance principle states that the landscape resistance denotes to the arrangement of spatial elements, especially barriers, conduits, and highly heterogeneous areas that offer resistance to flow or movement of species, energy, material, and disturbance over a landscape. The grain size principle states that a coarse grain landscape containing fine grain areas is optimum to provide for large space ecological benefits, multi-habitat species including human and a breadth of environmental resources and conditions. In case of landscape change, it states that land is transformed by several spatial and temporal processes overlapping in order, including perforation, fragmentation, and attrition, which increase habitat loss and isolation, but otherwise cause very different effects on spatial pattern and ecological processes. The mosaic sequence principle states that land is transformed from more to less suitable habitat in a small number of basic mosaic sequences. The ecologically based by in progressive parallel strips from an edge through modification of this pattern lead to an ecologically optimum sequence. The last category, application, under this we will find two basic principles: aggregate with outliers and indispensable patterns. The aggregate with outliers principle states that land containing human is best arranged ecologically by aggregating land uses, yet maintaining small patches and corridors of nature throughout developed areas, as well as outliers of human activity, especially arranged along major boundaries. And indispensable pattern states that top priority patterns of protection with no known substitute for their ecological benefits are a few large natural vegetation patches, wide vegetated corridors protecting watercourses, connectivity for movement of key species among large patches and small patches, and corridors providing heterogeneous bits of nature throughout developed areas. Then what are the methods to study landscape ecology? The methods includes approaches and tools for collection, analysis, and integration of both, spatial and non-spatial data. Data collection methods like sampling and observations. When we talk about experimentation, it is also increasingly being used, even though challenges in identifying landscape of large heterogeneous areas are very difficult. So experimentation has some limitation. So in sampling and experimentation, we usually require field work. So that's why when we talk about a field work in this particular landscape study, that is very large and heterogeneous area, GIS remote sensing techniques have become an essential tool for obtaining large-scale spatial data. Tools, spatial statistic or geostatistic, for example, spatial autocorrelation, Kriging spectral analysis, and trend surface analysis, along with spatial software such as FracStats and Patch Analyst are tools highly useful for analyzing landscape patterns. You will find out in details about this particular specific models what we're talking here when you Google out very easily. I will not go in detail here. As landscape structure management practice often vary across space, that one of the important models, spatially explicit models. These models are particularly useful in predicting the future trend and the rate of change, which further helps in developing a policy for sustainable management of the landscape. These spatially explicit models are computer-based that account for the ecological and socioeconomic differences among different locations in the landscape and allow efficient analysis of spatial interaction. So combining remote sensing and GIS data in these spatially explicit models is of great help to especially natural resource managers. So with appropriate arrangement of different landscape elements in space and the time, with data examined in the form of different thematic map for a particular area or region, the comparison of management alternative and ecological consequence become much easy by using these spatially explicit models. Then when you talk about landscape, and if you look into some of the problems we are facing like acid rain, global climate change, habitat fragmentation, and like conservation of biodiversity, this all require revealing patterns and the process at a very broad scale. So while we address such kind of broad scale issues, then ecologists are aware that the importance of choosing appropriate scale for conducting research or understanding the issues. So it is very imperative to first understand the concept of scale. So in a very brief, then scale refers to cartographic scale here. That is a degree of spatial reduction indicating the smaller dimension representing a larger unit of measure. So cartographic scale is expressed as the ratio or representative fraction of distance on the map to distance on the surface of the earth that is represented on a map or image. For example, we have the scale of 1:10,000 or 1:100,000. So a very fine resolution means large map of a small spatial extent. And very coarse resolution means that the maps cover large areas and do not reflect much details. Like it's very common in most of the physiographic this map, that is 1:250,000. But landscape ecologists often refers to scale as a problem or challenge, looking into its heterogeneous characters. The reasons are, it's very difficult in understanding and predicting an ecological attribute over a large area. Then the logistic problems associated with sampling or experimentation over a large areas and the associated statistical problem of pseudo replication. So these are some of the challenges, we can say limitation. So when we look, we are trying as a landscape ecologist. What are evolution and theory? If you look into evolution and theory, in the 1980s, when landscape ecology emerged as a specialized field, the objective of ecologists was to differentiate ecosystems not only by their heterogeneity, but also by the role of human activities in its dynamics and in emergence of environmental problems. A landscape is the result of a continuous confrontation between society, as you know, and its environment, reflects the spatial manifestation of the relation between human and their environment. So we should recognize this dynamic interaction between environment and society in the genesis and changes in landscape, and the relative importance of one or the other varying according to the area and the time gap. We can look into four important theories: the hierarchy theory, fractal geometry theory, percolation theory, self-organized criticality theory. A hierarchy theory is defined as a system of interconnection wherein the higher levels constrains the lower levels to various degrees depending on time of constraints of the behavior. And this theory states that ecological organization is developed in a hierarchical structure. So in a hierarchical system, at every level there are elements that's termed as holons that are at the same time both wholes and the parts of that system. And levels are distinguished by difference in the rates or frequencies of their characteristic processes. So holons have characteristic rates of behavior, and these rates place them at certain levels in the hierarchy of holons. For example, an individual organism as a holon can interact with other individual organisms because both operates at the same space and time scale. But an individual organism cannot interact with a biome. There are orders of magnitude different in scale. So to the individual organism, the biome is a relatively constant background or context within which it operates. Thus, temporal scale serve as important criteria for identifying levels within a hierarchy and different scales of space and time over which controls operate. See in this figure, the top line, line number 3 is slope variable, one that would serve as a constraint to the lower level. This may change so slowly that it is perceived as a constant by an observer. And if you look into the middle line, line number 2, it might be the scale at which an observer measures change in the system. And the lower line, that is line number 1, is very fast variable, one that might change so quickly that its changes could not measure using the scale adopted by the observer. The important concepts in the hierarchy theory, the importance of considering at least 3 hierarchical levels in any study, you will find out that in hierarchy theory. Although the variables that influence a process may or may not change with scale, a shift in the relative importance of variables or the perceived direction of a relation often occurs when the spatial or temporal scales are changed. It also suggests that multiple scales of pattern will exist in landscapes because of the multiple scales at which processes are happening. This theory tells us that attention should be focused directly on the scales at which phenomena of interest occurs, and there is no single universal scale for studying this. So landscape or any other ecological system, if we change the scales, the relevant processes or even the direction of relationship that we observe, it may change. So the scale of interest must be dictated by the question or phenomena of interest. So finite scale processes may be viewed as a detail required to explain the phenomena at the focal scale, while broader scale patterns are the constraints that limit the potential range of rate processes. Next is fractal geometry. The fractal geometry identified classes of patterns that remain similar or repeats over a wider range of scales. If the assumptions of fractal theory are simply satisfied, extrapolation of spatial pattern across scales become possible, allowing broad scale patterns to be predicted from fine scale measurements. An early application of the fractal geometry for landscape studies was the use of the fractal dimension as an index of human interference with landscape pattern. Other applications include studies of insect movement, measures of landscape structures, textures, species perception of landscape structure, generation of artificial landscape, characterizing landscape pattern, and using fractal theory for landscape design. The percolation theory, proposed by Stoffer and Aharoni in 1992, it deals with spatial patterns in randomly assembled systems. So the application of percolation theory to landscape studies has addressed a series of questions dealing with the size, shape, and connectivity of habitat as a function of the percentage of a landscape occupied by that habitat type. Because percolation theory generates patterns in the absence of specific processes, the comparison of random maps with actual landscape provides a neutral model capable of defining significant departures from randomness of pattern landscapes. So this theory has offered important insights into natures of connectivity or its inverse, that is fragmentation on landscape. The last one, that is self-organized criticality theory. This theory states that open complex system that is system with many independent components may be described by power law statistic over many order of magnitude. Because these systems are self-similar, a fundamental understanding of scale-dependent phenomena can emerge from studies of self-organized criticality. Some of the well-studied examples of physical systems that display the properties of self-organized criticality include avalanche in sand dunes, earthquakes in a ferromagnetic system. In ecology, canopy gaps in rainforest, river flows, and co-evolution in multi-species. Nowadays, there is an increasing problem of landscape fragmentation at landscape level, subdividing the previous large and continuous extension of land into relatively small and isolated patches. So the consequences of this landscape fragmentation brings habitat loss for plant and animal species, loss of several direct and indirect ecosystem services, habitat creation for others, decreased connectivity of remaining vegetation, decreased patch size, increased distance between the patches, and increase in yields at the expense of interior habitat. You will see in many tropical countries, the ongoing landscape change and the forest fragmentation through expansion of human land use are of major concern to future sustainability. So extensive land use not only leads to large natural vegetation being split in forest island in a fragmented landscape. This promotes forest degradation due to logging, ground fires, and overhunting, and have serious negative impact on biodiversity. So, for developing future strategies of management, studies of land cover change fragmentation is very much required. What are the factors affecting change of landscape diversity? Let us look into a few of them. Agricultural intensification, agricultural abandonment, fire, deforestation, livestock grazing, infrastructure development. These are some of the factors that affect on landscape diversity. When you talk about agricultural intensification, you will see the surface characteristic of the landscape, soil characteristic, surface water resources, hydrological patterns, natural vegetation, and input of several agrochemicals are there. Abandonment of agriculture for a specific period is a pattern which is very common to several industrialized countries, and it's very common, highly common in hilly and mountainous areas of northern India. And in case of northeast India, you will see shifting agriculture. It's very prevalent. That leads to change in landscape feature from time to time. Large-scale devastation of forests occur due to regular forest fires, though so that may be either natural or man-made. This is also one of the factors affecting changes on landscape diversity. Deforestation that modifies the structure and function of the landscape, increases fragmentation, expands its habitat, modifies diversity of standage, creates linear boundary and gaps, and facilitates immigration of open species into the forest interior. Livestock grazing, which is an important feature that modifies landscape, especially its ground vegetation and soil characteristic. However, just disturbances like livestock grazing are density dependent, and plant adaptation is strictly linked to the severity of disturbances. Infrastructure development in the form of urbanization and infrastructure development like road, railways and airports that cover broad areas of the earth that have severe consequences to the landscapes. Then we talk about sustainability, and we talk from sustainability science point of view. We understand that sustainability science is to study the interaction between nature and society. So we need to understand landscape ecology, and specifically when we understand the landscape ecology, it is very much important to understand this landscape ecology and natural resource management interlinkages. So management of natural resources, as you know, is very complex due to the interaction among ecological, political, socio-economic, demographic and behavioral factors. So in order to address these great challenges in natural resource management and to achieve sustainability of natural resources in the future, the natural resource managers need insightful guidance and a new perspective from emerging discipline like landscape ecology. And as we know, the main goal of landscape ecology is to understand the causes and ecological consequences of spatial heterogeneity across landscape and find ways and means for its sustainable but unavoidable utilization. And this landscape ecology looks at the structure, their dynamic relationship, process and function in a landscape and its management for the benefit of all beings. On the other hand, natural resource management aims towards sustaining these natural resources for societal values like the direct value like timber, wildlife, fish, indirect value like water quality, even biodiversity. Although the goals of landscape ecology and natural resource management look different, they are not in conflict, and in reality, it can go hand in hand. And this landscape ecology natural resource management can be mutually beneficial. And if you look into landscape ecology, it offers tools, a set of techniques to quantify and track changes in space and time, which is very important as a natural resource manager. What are the features of landscape ecology? When we look into traditional natural resource management, it has met numerous societal needs. It has also caused a host of problems, such as conflicts between management of short-term and long-term benefits, between management at a small scale and large scale, and between management of different natural resources. To overcome the shortcomings of traditional management, it is necessary to facilitate shifts in management paradigm using a landscape perspective. So we need to understand the cultural knowledge and landscape management relation. When we talk about natural resource management at regional global scale, it is essential to tie landscape structure with multi-scale management, to link landscape function with cross-boundary management, to connect landscape change with adaptive management and to use integrated management techniques by incorporating multi-scale, cross-boundary and adaptive management to achieve sustainable landscape integrity. If you look at the characteristics of landscape, you will see essentially all landscape are cultural, subject to cultural influences and are a source of cultural knowledge. And ensure sustainability of ecological system is achievable only within the context of cultural landscape. For example, we cannot understand and manage the natural environment unless we understand the human culture that shaped it over the years in that region. So thus, its management becomes an expression of that culture. We must then also understand the environment to comprehend how it in turn reshapes that culture through feedback process. So equal emphasis should therefore be given to the cultural aspect of ecosystem in their management, and so the concept of biocultural landscape come up. So in this way, landscape ecology gives a space from single-scale management to multi-scale management, from static management to adaptive management, from isolated management to integrated management. How it is given, let us look into. When look into from single-scale management to multi-scale management, you will see traditional management, most of traditional management has actually taken place at a single spatial scale. For example, forestry. In forestry, you will see management often occur at a stand level. Because a landscape is usually heterogeneous and ecological consequences are often scale-dependent, management must be similarly carried out at a multiple scales such as pace, class, and landscape. If no patches are the same, then it would be necessary to undertake different management activities in different patches to accommodate landscape heterogeneity. If two or more patches share the same characteristic, these patches can be grouped and categorized into same class and could be managed accordingly. So in this way, from a single scale management, in case of example, in case of entire forest landscape, then we have to follow multi-scale management, looking the fragments, different patches as different landscape. If you look from static management to adaptive management, since landscape are constantly changing due to natural and anthropogenic disturbances, like even the practices we follow for managing that particular landscape, the management practice suitable for previous condition are not always appropriate for later condition. So it needs to be changed accordingly with time. That's why adaptive management has been increasingly used for addressing such dynamic and uncertain issues and to accumulate knowledge. Thus, it reduces uncertainty about the system. So we have to use the principle of landscape ecology from the approach of static management to adaptive management. From isolated management to integrated management. As you know, it is very crucial that different types of natural resource management may be coordinated in both space and time in accordance with the ecological economic implication. Here, integrated management shares many features with widely discussed ecosystem management. And this integrated management also takes a landscape perspective by dynamically incorporating spatial interaction across heterogeneous landscape to achieve sustainable landscape integrity. We will see how these four systems, major aspects of landscape and the four management paradigms are interrelated to each other from this diagram. These are some of the references which I depend for this presentation. So in this session, we have touched upon the concept of landscape ecology, its principle, methods, and evolution and theory, and what are the factors that affect the changes on landscape diversity in brief, and relation between landscape ecology and natural resource management, and what are the future of landscape ecology. So with this concept, I'm sure we'll be able to understand link with your concept of sustainability. Thank you. Meet you in the next session.